I'm the CEO of Yardstick. We are a soil carbon measurement company. A lot of times conversations around soil carbon come alongside so-called regenerative agriculture, basically acknowledging, hey, the way that we're farming and ranching today has a massive greenhouse gas footprint. And so here's a little video you can see of me using one of our prototypes this past spring. Takes about 30 seconds. It's non-destructive. You don't have to remove soils from the field. And our goal is really to be the data backbone of soil carbon around the world.
I'd imagine it's important in order to get an accurate measurement over a large piece of land to do a large number of samples, right? And so having this technology that can do things quickly and cheaply and non-disruptively seems like you could get way more accurate representation.
Absolutely. Yep. And the reason why that high density sampling is important for carbon especially is because the spatial variability of soil carbon is high. If you're trying to measure something that doesn't have a lot of variability, like you don't need a lot of samples actually. So it's not inherent to, large areas that drives a demand, a need for high density. It's specifically that in the instance of this particular thing we're looking at, carbon, the XY spatial variability is massive. So, within a given field, imagine a 100-acre field farmed in corn for 30 years in a very consistent way, identically every year. You'll still have parts of the field that could be 1.5% carbon and parts of the field that could be 3.5% carbon. And we can't predict what's going to be what. So the spatial variability in X and Y is very high. It's non-random, so you can't model it very well. And we care about the distribution of carbon in the Z dimension too, by depth. So that's usually called the soil profile. And we're trying to track the change in those carbon stocks over time. So all of a sudden we're stacking up like all these dimensions of measurement that make it really, really hard. And because it is so broadly spatially distributed and unevenly spatially distributed, you're absolutely right. We need high density to capture it. High density is difficult when every single one of those sample sites is, 7 minutes of backbreaking work and $40. So what we're trying to do is make it so cheap and fast and simple that we can blanket that whole field with a whole bunch of sample sites to better characterize the soil carbon stocks of the field, because that's what we care about at the end of the day. I want to see this field go from X tons today in the soil to Y tons, a larger number, hopefully, in the future.
I'm thinking with all that variation, the question of, how do you know that you have enough samples is kind of like, well, you have to do too many, right? And that's the only way you can know that you've done enough.
Yeah, that's not the only way, but that is an important way. Like you'll be able to see the prediction of the stock sort of plateau, right? There'll be an asymptote as you're reaching like the true stock. Thankfully, there are other tools, namely like get a PhD in statistics. So this is also part of our offering, is developing those sampling plans. So what we do is we use these statistical techniques to do what's called stratification. And stratification basically means, can I look at a field? Can I estimate where I'm more or less likely to find carbon? Because that's the thing I'm looking for. And then can I break this field into subsections that have statistically identical likelihood, of having the presence of carbon? Because then I can concentrate my sampling in areas where I expect more carbon, and I can have thinner sampling in areas where I don't expect to have it. What that means is that our sample plans end up looking kind of random. You're like, there's a big cluster of dots right here, and there's kind of none over there. So it's hard because it doesn't jive with our sort of intuition around like, even coverage. But that's exactly why Yardstick generating those plans, sampling plans for our customers, is a core part of our offering. That's also why in this grant we got last fall, one of our co-researchers is a guy named Alex McBratney, and he's at the University of Sydney in Australia. He's a digital soil mapping guy. All he thinks about all day long is the statistical techniques for developing these plans. Because even when each sample site is low cost, it is, non-zero cost. And so we want to do the exact right number of samples. Any fewer, and the accuracy of your sampling effort is compromised. Any more, and you're just wasting money. And at the end of the day, that's what we're trying to do, is we're trying to make these projects generate revenue for farmers to incentivize these practices. So cost is very, very important, even as Yardstick comes to market with a much lower cost offering.
As I'm listening to the challenges you're confronting and the problems you're solving, it seems like there may be machine learning applications here. Once you have enough data, train an algorithm to understand these things better than we can.
Bingo. Yep. And especially in the process of training our sensor, again, back to my like, what's the shape of organic carbon? That's our current state as a company is when we're sampling this fall, we're taking conventional soil samples that do go to a lab directly next to every place that we're taking a spectral reading. And then we treat those lab results as true data, as accurate. And then we use machine learning to tell the probe, hey, here's 100 sample sites. We've got lab data, and then we've got spectral data right next to it. Hey, spectrometer, treat that lab data as truth, and therefore develop a knowledge and understanding of what the shape of that organic carbon is. Those are exactly the techniques that are employed there. And then as we collect more over time, that model gets more and more accurate.
This is awesome. So congrats on the DOE award. And what I'm hearing is you're not really just developing an affordable spectrometer. It's much more than that. So kind of what is it? You're talking about these soil, the plans and the mapping, and you've talked about customers. So when is it available and who are your customers?
Yeah, so I'll answer the last question first. We have a few different flavors of customers today. And they're customers of our software offerings today because that's the only thing that's ready. As I mentioned, we're still in development for the hardware. And they kind of break down into 4 different buckets. So one are brands and houses of brands. I'm, Post Cereals, I'm General Mills, and I want to decarbonize my supply chain. Hey, oat farmers, adopt better climate practices so I can say that your Cheerios are regeneratively grown, or sort of climate friendly, that sort of thing. There's also insetting in that category. So brands that want to address their net zero goals by developing offsets internally within their supply chains. 2 are sort of pure play project developers where their whole business model is taking a cut of the revenue potential of offsets generated from these programs. Most visible company there in soil carbon is Indigo, based here in Boston, actually. And so they're saying, hey, farmers, enroll in these programs. I'm going to sell your tons to IBM so that IBM can hit their net zero goals, and I'm going to take 20%. That kind of thing. The third are agricultural input companies, so selling seeds, selling fertilizer. Historically, they've been developing their products to increase yield, decrease water requirements. And now, like sequestration potential could potentially be this whole new dimension of performance for crops. So most visibly, the Salk Institute has been doing work around GM crops where sequestration potential is an explicit focus of the organism. And then the 4th bucket are commodity buyers. So if you're a Cargill, and I buy your corn today, shouldn't I also buy your carbon, right? You've got a crop above ground, you've got a crop below ground, like I'll buy them both. Each of these customers have like slightly different requirements, but they're probably 85% the same today. They'll diverge over time, but right now everyone's sort of in exploratory mode. In terms of the offering, we break it into plan, measure, and analyze. So most folks get most excited about our hardware immediately because it's visible, and especially agronomists and soil scientists are like, oh my gosh, the existing method is a pain. I want a better way. But on the other side of measure is plan and analyze. So plan is creating the sampling plans that I described. And then analyze is how do we make sense of this data? Our customers don't want like a CSV emailed to them. They want things to make sense. So we're building the web platform to display that data, to interpret it, to share it with others, to share with registries, to share with customers as you may be selling tons. And so what that means is for a given farmer or a project developer customer, they basically say, hey, Yardstick, here's field boundaries, here's outlines of all of my farms, like you take it from there. So we do the stratification on sample plan design. It's Yardstick people holding Yardstick hardware that go out and do the actual measurement. And then that measurement data shows up again on our platform after the fact where we make sense of it and deliver it back to the customer. Hey, here are your carbon stocks today. And, I'll be back in a few years to measure it again to show the change.
Can you talk more about the kind of long-term monitoring implications? In order for this to be, kind of real in terms of climate and kind of at an equal footing with mitigation and, keeping coal in the ground, there's got to be this long-term kind of assurance, I would think, that the changes are, real and, incremental and permanent, right?
Yeah, permanence is that's exactly the world. In the carbon removal, CDR, carbon dioxide removal scene. Yeah, it's really hard because let's contrast that with direct air capture, DAC, which are giant CO2 scrubber kind of fan. They kind of just look like an air conditioner. They pull atmospheric concentration CO2. When you run those machines, you end up with CO2 like in a canister. And you're like, it's right there. Like, I know it's there. It's going to stay there, as long as I pay attention to this canister. With soils, you're like, Yardstick says it's down there. But like, what if it's re-emitted, right? What if a farmer that adopts conservation or no-till practices changes their mind, and a year or two later goes back to full tillage. There's strong evidence that reversals would happen, that the sequestered CO2 in those soils would be re-released. So there's a few different pieces. One is measure it frequently enough that you can see if that's happened. So if we can reduce the cost of measurement by an order of magnitude the way Yardstick thinks we can, you just go back every few years and you check again. And that's already part of the business model of offsets. The second way to do it is to adopt other technologies that are even lower cost. So in soil carbon, there's a lot of enthusiasm around remote sensing, satellite approaches right now. Those are a really poor fit for directly quantifying the stocks, but they could be a great fit for helping us understand some stuff that happens above ground. So for example, tillage, or even better, cover cropping. Hey, did Farmer Jane adopt cover cropping the way she told me she would? Cover cropping, it's hard to see from the sky, but it's literally above ground, so you can see it from the sky. So rather than having to pay somebody to go out to the farm every January and be like, all right, you cover cropping, is it there? Yeah, it's there. Point a satellite at her farm and take a look and see if you can see, little cover crop popping up. So that's an example of a complementary technology that is definitely not a competitor to Yardstick, but will be part of the total MRV, monitoring, reporting, and verification stack of the future. And then the third piece of it is contracts. So, we make commitments all the time in the business world, and you don't always need somebody sitting there watching you to see if you're doing it or not. I mentioned this third because it needs to be done in concert with other direct observable ways of confirming behavior or outcomes. But right now, soil carbon is really in its infancy of how we're going to define these contracts and these commitments with each other. And I think there's a lot of really amazing work to be done. I can't believe I'm saying I can't wait for a bunch of lawyers to get involved, but it actually really is important that many of these commitments get papered in ways that are flexible appropriately, but also inflexible, so that when people make commitments, we know they're going to stick with them. That's also going to be a big part of prices increasing, that folks can have greater confidence that when a farmer says, I will do blank and you will get blank, that they're actually going to do it over the long haul. That said, oftentimes folks like to talk crap about soil in contrast to engineered solutions like DAC. Yardstick's point is not that soil carbon is the only way or the best way. I love DAC because I don't want climate change, catastrophe. We're not at a point where I think we can afford to agree that strategy X is good and strategy Y is bad. And any criticisms lobbed at soil carbon in terms of its permanence as compared to engineered solutions like DAC, I'm yeah, that's a good point. I don't think it's important for soil to try and compete in those dimensions, because there's other things that make soil really compelling compared to DAC today. Number one, I can do it today. Number two, I don't have to build a giant freaking $40 million plant in Iceland. And number three, I think it's really important that soil carbon is basically a political and cultural judo move in America, especially because stereotypically, right? A lot of the parts of the country that grow most of our crops are most skeptical of some of these issues. And so if I could find a way to enroll millions of people and hundreds of millions of acres in fighting climate change without having to convince them to not listen to their politicians, that's a win. I'm suspicious, as much as everybody else, that purely market-based solutions are sufficient. Eventually, people do have to believe in order to behave, but you'd be surprised how many farmers stop freaking out about climate change when you pay them to behave as though they do believe in it.
Iowa farmers and wind turbines are a good example.
Yeah, absolutely. That thing's big and weird. Oh, you're going to pay me to put it on my land? Oh, actually, it's kind of peaceful, and now I'm making more money. That's good. That's really, really good. That's the power of markets. Markets are totally insufficient. I am a skeptical capitalist as much as everybody else. We are in some really horrifying examples of destructive, extractive late stage capitalism that we need to reckon with. And also, markets are powerful.
Yeah. And from what I've heard, it makes the soil healthier anyway and can improve yields and all that stuff. So it's not just a one way.
Totally. Yeah. And again, the answer is way more nuanced than many documentaries, would have you believe. So for example, yields may take a hit in the first few years of a regenerative transition, but they recover, as best evidence we can tell, if you have really good mentorship, for example. This is great work that Christine's team at the Soil Health Institute has done to show that the cultural and kind of anthropological dimensions of these transitions are almost as important as the scientific or the technical pieces of it. And I think that's also a big part of why there's a lot of broad enthusiasm here, because even if climate isn't the only thing that you care about, or even the primary thing you care about, like better soil health, water infiltration, reducing N inputs, reducing cost, like those are things that matter a lot to people, understandably. And I think that's why if we can put more high quality scientific evidence around it, regenerative agriculture can be like a cool big tent experience of a lot of people with very different goals getting excited about a lot of the same things.
As people are reading more about regenerative agriculture, what else should they be thinking about?
I think another important thing that's going on in the background that's not often enough acknowledged is how agriculture in America is basically like entirely predicated on land theft from Native and Indigenous people. Like agriculture does not exist in America without mass land theft. And it's especially challenging today because agriculture, for many horrifying reasons, is broadly seen as a white industry, and demographically, statistically, it's overwhelmingly white because of many of those same kind of experiences of disenfranchisement. And yet many of the practices that are called regenerative agriculture descend like directly from some traditional agricultural practices of Native people. So there's like a textbook white theft thing going on here that's rarely acknowledged. And I don't really know what many of the solutions to that issue are, but I think it's important that folks in the scene acknowledge it and kind of confront it as like an awkward and messy truth that unsurprisingly is the part of every, piece of American history when you really dig into it. That's also why, as a company, Yardstick is trying to be vocal in instances where there's legislation that could either benefit or not benefit, people of color or Native farmers and ranchers. So there's a Justice for Black Farmers bill that Cory Booker has introduced. The Growing Climate Solutions Act is a piece of legislature that's under debate right now that could or could not acknowledge the longstanding multi-century, almost literally racist history of USDA. USDA itself has the largest civil rights settlement in all time in America was against USDA for unfair lending practices against farmers of color, called Pigford. You should Google it. And these things are going to keep continuing unless white people in power like me pay attention and start to show up for these conversations in a different way. So even as I think a lot of this enthusiasm is growing, and rightly so, massive potential for all kinds of positive benefits, I think it's really important to acknowledge that history and ensure that whatever we're doing bakes a justice lens into it. Again, what are the details of how we do that? Oof, I am not prepared to answer the question, but I'm trying to do a better job of paying attention to it. And I think anybody who cares about agriculture getting better in a climate sense also needs to pay attention to how it can get better in this broader justice and cultural sense.
Hey, Jeannie, what are our friends at the farm school doing about that?
I'm glad you asked. And Chris, I'm really glad you mentioned this. So since we're in Massachusetts, the farm school in Central Mass is doing really hard work on this. They're in a relationship with the Nipmuc people of the area where the farm school is located. Also, Red Fire Farm and the book Farming While Black is a really inspirational piece of work that anybody interested in this should take a look at.
Highly recommend this one too.
Yeah, awesome.
Nerd Show notes will have book links.
Well, it's been a real pleasure.
Likewise. Thanks for having me.
Chris.
We learned a lot.
See ya. Have a great day.